All right, let's get into the fall of the West. What's happening in Western culture? Well, over in France, a lot. Okay. France is on fire. And it's not just those parts of France that you might not be familiar with. It's big areas of France, prominent Paris, Bordeaux, okay, on fire because of an incident that occurred a couple of weeks ago. In a post earlier this week, we're reading from the Zero Hedge. We wrote that Paris was burning in the wake of the police shooting of a North African teen. Violence and arson have since spread to multiple cities in France, including Marseille, where rioters attempted to torch that city's historic largest public library. Now, you can go out there and look and find this stuff. I'm not going to air it simply because you know how YouTube is. I'll probably get a strike if I aired it because it's violent footage. And plus, you're not supposed to know what's going on in France. Okay, now somebody tell me, how often are they reporting on what's going on in France? They're not, as ubiquitously as they would say if there was a, you know, uh, a white guy that, did a mass shooting. Okay, and we'll get to that in a minute, how some mass shootings are being covered, but stand by. We're not being told what's going on in France for a variety of reasons. All right. Some extraordinary video of the fires and violence in France is appearing on social media. Again, I encourage you, go check it out. It's incredible. All right. So you got individuals that are from a different culture and they are not assimilating into the Western culture of France. And this is the fault of the French people, because in order to solve the problem of low birth rates, which all of the Western countries are having difficulty with, and some of the Eastern ones as well, right? Having an issue. China is even having a birth rate issue at this point. But in order to solve this issue, the Western Europeans thought it'd be a great idea to start just abolishing their borders, pretty much, kind of like what we're doing on the southern border of the United States right now. So abolish the border, let whoever come in from wherever, no problem. And understand, people, that when this happens, I don't care what the politicians say, this is not about some benevolence. We want to help people. No, it is about import payers. That's what it's about. Okay. So, Europe's doing this, but they're not taking into account the fact that most of the people coming over, apparently, okay, are not interested in assimilating. They're not interested in doing that. It's curious, too, because if you're leaving a culture, if you're actually fleeing a culture, why would you want to bring all of that into the place that you're seeking a better life in? I'm not suggesting that people abandon their cultural heritage. I'm not suggesting that. I'm just saying that with regard to, some of the aspects of your culture, you got to be honest with yourself and say, okay, well, what they were obviously didn't work because I had to leave. I wanted to do whatever I needed to do to get out. So much so that I wasn't even willing to wait for the legal process. I just wanted to get over there however I could, whenever I could. So you got a cadre of folk that don't want to assimilate into France. They see something occur. The racialization of Western society has been at a fever pitch. You've seen the media, non-governmental organizations, and government just pump this into the heads of societies, from America to France, Canada, all of Britain, all over the Western world. If you're white, you're evil, and to an extent, Black people can do no wrong, no wrong. Let's just be patently obvious about this and honest about it. All right, so you've got an individual that was shot by the police in France, And just like we've seen in America, and I'll be quite honest with you, I'm light on facts here because it's tough getting information out of this foreign country, a foreign country with a different language. And I always want to come on here and be as accurate as possible, right? But I do know that the police stopped an individual in a car, and something occurred between that stop and then that individual was shot. Don't know if the French police are saying it was justified or not. Obviously, the protesters think it was unjustified. But I'm funny in the way that I like to wait for facts to come out before I start to say, hey, it was this way or that way. Let's just wait for the facts, right? Well, and people don't do that anymore. Part of the reason why is because we're actively rejecting a Western philosophical tradition, that being reason, okay, using our critical thinking skills. The civil unrest has gotten to the point where former French presidential candidate Eric Zemmour, these are French names. If I'm mispronouncing them, I apologize. He described this as the early stages of a civil war. Now, you might say, why is that? Why is it a civil war? Well, it's actually looking like maybe a civil war wrapped inside a coup against Emmanuel Macron, president of France. Zemmour says, we are in the early stages of a civil war. That's obvious. Give me a second, Henry, so you guys can track this with me. Okay. All right, Zemmour says, we're in the early stages of a civil war. That's obvious. It's an ethnic war. We can see that it's a race war. We see what forces are involved. We need someone determined and firm. The problem, above all, is the number of immigrants. Okay, this is according to this former presidential candidate in France. Many police, now this is, he's talking about civil war. Now let's go into what the police have to say, where this starts looking like the rhetoric you might find before a coup. And remember, we're talking about France here. These are the people who cut the heads off of Louis and Marie Antoinette. Okay, this is revolutionary DNA. James Gavin, hello. Oh, okay. Well, good question, James. Who are these NGOs, non-governmental organizations? Because, guys, I'm always talking about this axis of global corporations, governments, and NGOs or non-governmental organizations. So we got a lot of them out there. The Bank for International Settlements is one. It's the central bank of central banks. You can think of them that way. Headed up by Augustine Carstens. Check him out, all right? They do things like this. Give you an example. Bank of International Settlements is orchestrating the move to central bank digital currencies for all of their member central banks, including the Fed here in America, the Federal Reserve Bank. So that's one. We've got the World Economic Forum. You all are familiar with Klaus Schwab, right? His organization is on record as saying by the early 2030s, you will own nothing and be happy. Look behind me, guys. I have my bookcase, and on this floor and throughout, this is my office. My wife, we built an office for her outside on the property. Her office is really nice. Mine is got a lot of books. I look like one of those eccentric old professors with a lot of books and magazines and newspaper articles all over the floor. Let's talk about ownership. You will own nothing. Well, PETA, another non-governmental organization, is talking about rewriting sections of the Bible. Okay, now they ain't gonna do that to my Bible because they're not coming into my house and rewriting anything. It's in hard copy on my desk. This is the power of ownership. Own your books. I have a Kindle, and I do have some titles on that, but every title I have electronically, I have in hard copy form. There are books in the basement. There are books everywhere in this house. The book is one example of the importance of ownership. Also, I love Star Trek. Paramount, I have the Paramount streaming service. Do you know they took the Star Trek movies off of their own service? They own Star Trek, and they put them on HBO for a while to make a little money. I didn't care. I own the DVD. Ownership in every aspect of your life, guys. So we mentioned PETA, they're low level. World Economic Forum, Bank of International Settlements, World Bank, International Monetary Fund. So those are some of the non-governmental organizations. When we term that's what we're talking about. In the organization, with the exception of PETA, I believe PETA actually might be international, but these organizations are international. And Maria 28 says correctly, they're backed by ideological billionaires. Absolutely. George Soros, Bill Gates, Mark Zuckerberg. Okay. That's where the World Economic Forum gets its funding, from these organizations, from these corporations, rather. So it's an incestuous little web that they've woven. Okay. So back to what's going on in France. So we talked about the presidential candidate and how he laid out how this is looking like a civil war. Now let's talk about the police. The police, this gets really interesting. And if I'm Macron, president of France, I'm sleeping with one eye open after I hear this. Many French police seem to agree with the former presidential candidate, Zemmour. As French entrepreneur Arnaud Bertrand suggests below, this is a wealthy individual in France. He says, give me a sec, guys. Just track it so you guys can read it too on the screen if you like. We're truly witnessing a radicalization on both sides in France. This is an unreal communique by the main French police unions, essentially declaring France is in a civil war and that the police is in the resistance against the government. This is the translation. And if this sounds a little cumbersome and ham-handed in English, just understand that this stuff is being translated into English. Okay, so here's the translation. This is from the police, and specifically, this is from, what's this guy's name? Viers. In any event, now that's enough. Facing these listen to how strident this is. Facing these savage hordes, asking for calm is no longer enough. It must be imposed. Restoring the Republican order and putting the apprehended beyond the capacity to harm should be the only political signals to give. In the face of such exactions, the police family must stand together. Let's pause right there. Understand the gravity of what he's saying. The police family must stand together. By that, he is trying to galvanize the police and say, hey, look, it's us against them. Our colleagues, like the majority of citizens, can no longer bear the tyranny of these violent minorities. The time is not for union action, but for combat against these pests. Surrendering, capitulating, and pleasing them by laying down arms are not the solutions in light of the gravity of the situation. And I'm going to tell you something about that last statement. We have seen a form of capitulation here in America with the whole Black Lives Matter and the defund the police movement. We'll get to what's going on in America in minutes, but he's right. If you say, okay, people are going to break the law, we're just going to give space to destroy. That's a quote that was made by the mayor, Stephanie Rawlins Blake, of Baltimore City back when the Frey incident took place and there was a riot in the city. And instead of mobilizing the police immediately to put it down, she went to the media and she said, this is a quote, look it up. I know it's unbelievable. She said, we're going to give them, quote, space to destroy, unquote. All right. And the criminal element in Baltimore City has been destroying ever since. That was 2015. We're going to get to Baltimore because you're not going to believe what just happened there a few nights ago. Okay, so the time is not for, okay. So when he says the time is not for union action, understand that he's saying, look, this is not, we're not talking administration. We're not talking about, protest. He says, this is not the time for union action, but for combat. All means must be put in place to restore the rule of law as quickly as possible. Once restored, we already know that we will relive this mess that we have been enduring for decades. For these reasons, Alliance Police Nationale and UNSA Police will take their responsibilities and warn the government from now on that at the end, we will be in action and without concrete measures for the legal protection of the police and appropriate penal response, significant means provided, the police will judge the extent of the consideration given. So he's saying, that statement is saying, look, we're going to take a more active role here. We're not waiting for orders from the government. This is absolutely out of control, and we're going to start to assert ourselves. This is a dangerous situation. Today, the police are in combat because we are at war. Tomorrow, we will be in resistance, and the government will have to become aware of it. This is revolutionary rhetoric that the police, and this is a national police force we're talking about. I worked in France for a little while, and when I was there, this is what happened. The subways in France are beautiful. This was in 1999. I was in Paris, and the subways are beautiful. So I had a camera at the time, not a cell phone camera, but I had one of those little cameras that you could buy. It was a disposable camera. You could buy it in like Rite Aid, and then you just drop it off, and they would develop the pictures, and you come back next week. I had one of those, and I was in one of the subway stations in France, and it was absolutely beautiful. The architecture, it was just unbelievably beautiful. So I'm taking pictures, right? Okay. So I leave the subway. I'm on my way back to Montparnasse, and I'm walking, beautiful city. And I get almost to my hotel, and I hear someone speaking in French, and the volume is kind of high on it. So I turn around, I'm like, oh, they must be talking to me, trying to get my attention. So I turn around, and it is a gendarme. Okay. And he's got the automatic weapon across his chest, and he didn't approach me in a threatening manner, or he was really calm about it, but I couldn't understand what he was saying, and he didn't understand what I was saying. And it just so happened that a colleague of mine, that at the time she worked for France Telecom, she just came out of nowhere. I don't know what the hell she was even doing in Montparnasse, but I thank God she was there, because she started speaking to him in French. And then she asked me, she said, where did you just come from? I said, well, I was in the subway. She said, what did you do when you were there? I said, well, when I got off the train, I started taking pictures. She was like, okay. And then she's explaining to him, this guy is from America. He is here with us, France Telecom. We're all doing business. It's all good. So the guy said, the gendarme said something to her. And then he said something to me that I interpreted as being very friendly in the way he said it, because he kind of smiled. And then he walked off. Okay. So that was the equivalent of having, if you're in America, having an FBI agent come up to you and say, hey, why were you taking pictures in the DC subway? Okay. And at the time, they had some incidents that I think the guy thought I was surveilling the joint, okay, for some future action. Quickly found out that I wasn't, and that was the end of the story. But that did occur with me. Now, I want you to know that over $1 billion of damage has been done in France. And there is speculation that some of the weapons that we sent over to Ukraine have been used in these protests. So the national police are hot under the collar, and they should be. Okay. Who wants to deal with criminal activity? I don't care who's committing it and what they look like. The Prime Minister of Poland put out a video comparing how peaceful Poland was compared to France. But Poland seems headed in the same direction as France, because they've got an immigration issue as well. Unfortunately, Poland and some other Eastern European countries seem too focused on past threats. The Soviet Union, which they apparently conflate with today's Russia, and not on the present threat of Western Europe importing hostile minority populations. If importing violent populations from the third world is the price of the European Union's grounds, maybe that's too high a price to take. Okay. So that's what's going on in France. We'll continue to monitor that because I don't believe that the situation is being thoroughly reported. Because remember, this is the American media. I don't have television. I don't have cable. Okay, I don't watch the televised news like CNN and Fox and all that. Haven't for 12 years. But I do know that I've seen clips on the internet of a burning building, people running around with TVs and baseball bats, and the CNN guy saying, "Hey, it's mostly peaceful." Do you remember Baghdad Bob during the Iraq War? And he was like, you had American tanks like right behind him and helicopters flying and launching rockets. And he's like, "Hey, everything's cool. Iraq has never been more secure. We're going to defeat the infidels. You just mark my words." That's what the American media does with the crime problem here in America today.